So in April this year, you wrote to the governors of 9 scheduled fifth areas. What are the responses that you've gotten so far?
Well, basically I wrote to all the governors to make them aware of their powers which they had. And then I also wrote to them, I appealed to them that they should invoke these powers as and when it became necessary. So I did this because you see I found that for many years these powers were not invoked by the governors. And I got a good response from the governors. In fact, 1 or 2 governors wrote back to me asking me for certain clarifications. But otherwise it's been good. I've made them aware at least.
Which are the governors who've written back?
You see, the governor of Chhattisgarh wrote back asking me for certain clarifications. The governor of Odisha actually acted on my letter. But I think most of the governors have taken that quite well, and I think it was necessary and it was worthwhile making that.
So what is being done on ground? How many of them have actually cancelled MOUs, revoked them?
You see, not a question of just cancelling, it's to make them aware of their rights, of what the 5th schedule in the constitution was meant for. And then, you see, they have a certain role to play in overseeing administrative affairs. So it was not just for cancelling MOUs, this was something which was done in general. For example, the Orissa governor did call the administrative machinery of the state, and I think he discussed with them and asked them to follow the directions of the Supreme Court. So that way it's an ongoing process, yes.
Okay. So is the lack of response from wherever you haven't gotten, is it worrisome?
No, not at all, you see, because you have to keep going on at it. Because see, after all, the governor, he's a representative of the central government, of the president, technically speaking. And see, ours is our constitution has its federal aspect where states have their own powers. And in fact, it's the state governments who have to really respond. They are the ones who've actually been flouting certain constitutional provisions and safeguards. And what worries me is, you see, the unrest that it had caused.
So what are the steps that these governors have taken that you're aware of?
You see, governors have been actually talking to the chief ministers. You see, I had written to the chief ministers and then to the governors to ensure that the Forest Right Acts is implemented, to ensure that, you see, pattas are given to these people, to see that panchayat extension to scheduled areas implemented in letter and in spirit. And above all this, of course, the most important thing is to ensure that constitutional safeguards are not flouted.
So now that the high-level committee panel has been formed to look into the socio-economic status of tribals, it's been often said that for such interventionist strategies to work, there needs to be an overlap between those who deliver services and those who are actually administering it. In most tribal areas, that's been absent. I mean, if you look at Koraput or if you look at Sukma, despite Koraput being in a special development area and despite the deployment of extra administrative resources, it still remains to be one of the most poor areas. So what do you think really is required to elevate the status of tribals?
You see, to elevate the level of tribals, it's not one thing that you need. You have to do many things. First of all, as I told you, the tribals didn't have anything which they could call their own. Because most of the areas where tribals and other forest dwellers are living, these were unsurveyed areas for many years. So when I say they had nothing of their own, you see, whatever they collected from those forest areas, whatever they sold, was at the mercy of the forest departments of the respective states. The occupation of the land for not decades but for hundreds of years was not regularized. So you see, once you got them out of that area, they had nothing to prove or show that they have been living over there for generations. So therefore, and that's precisely why the Forest Right Act was brought in. You see, for the implementation of the Forest Right Act, again, land and forest are both state subjects. I'm not blaming any particular state government for that, but in general, you see, the forest departments were not very keen on ensuring that these rights are granted, because they've been lording over these forest produce for many years. But initially what had happened was in 1927, when the Forest Act came, see, with the stroke of the pen, the homeland and the traditional sources of livelihood as far as these people are concerned. Were declared, as you see, that those areas were declared forests. They were denied of their own resources, and in a way, indirectly, you see, they were treated like as encroachers. Because what actually happened was what happened was the other way around. So this was actually to correct that historic injustice that this was done. So now somebody who's been enjoying all these areas, the fruits of these areas for many, many years, actually there was a lot of stiff resistance from them, so that had to be fought out. Now when I say state government is responsible, actually the resistance came not from the state governments, in the sense not from the chief ministers or not from the revenue department and others. State government, yes, technically yes, but it was basically this forest lobby which was totally against this. So slowly, see, that mindset had to be got over. Then I had to change several rules and guidelines after I became a minister. These were actually, there were a lot of recommendations made by the National Advisory Council. Several representations had been received from several other NGOs, voluntary organizations, from politicians, members of parliament, MLAs. I mean, after putting all together and also my own experience in it, I ultimately changed some rules, changed the guidelines, again communicated to the state governments, wrote myself to the chief ministers. So, it's a process which one has to go on with. You see, what needs to be done is to sensitize them, to make them aware. And you see, it's a process which will have to continue. I mean, you can't afford to give it up saying that, you see, they are insensitive or they are not doing it. But now actually, you see, then recently I've got the cabinet to clear a proposal for providing them a minimum support price. Or if I may say so, it's not a minimum support price, but a fair remunerative price for all the non-timber forest produce, because bamboo and tendu leaves also have been brought within the purview of non-timber forest produce. So you see, because once they're given the pattas, the rights are ensured. If they don't get a price for their produce, then that would serve no purpose. So this was actually basically to improve their economic conditions over there. Then subsequently, because of these extremist activities which are going on in these areas, central government has been sanctioning money every year, 30 crores a year for all these districts which have been identified. This is for an integrated action plan to bridge the critical gaps which exist in these areas. This is as far as communication, drinking water, or any other developmental work that's necessary. Because wherever tribals and forest dwellers are there are a lot of rich minerals available in this area. So it's not, you see, I'm not against development or against mining. Well, I'm sure nobody will disagree with me when I say that the process of development should include or take along with it the most exploited, the most marginalized, the most neglected sections of society. I mean, that's what our government stands for.
So your ministry was also looking into the investigation of the Mahan coal block in Madhya Pradesh. So what has happened in that regard?
You see, unfortunately, I don't have the power to investigate, but then I got a lot of representations. See, Mahan is in the 5th schedule areas. Now, as I told you, 5th schedule area has some special protections for people living over there. So when I learned that, or when I got a representation saying that some mining leases were given to companies which were neither owned or controlled by scheduled tribes, neither by the public sector companies, where government controlled most of the shares and controlled them. Then I thought, you see, this was again a blatant violation of the constitutional safeguards. So I wrote to my concerned colleagues, and I thought that I should take up this matter, make them aware, and something unconstitutional happens, something ultra vires the constitution happened in such a blatant manner. What will people do if the government doesn't respond, if the bureaucracy doesn't do anything? Today it's happened in Mahan, tomorrow it may happen somewhere else. So it's a process which goes on.
So, but the land rights activists are saying that some sections of the land acquisition bill are so open to interpretation that land can be snatched away from tribals just as easily. So what is your take on that?
You see, no act or law can be foolproof or watertight. I agree with you. There are some criticisms from certain section of activists to the effect of what you have just mentioned. But then there are others who are saying there's no use of this bill because industrialists cannot access land easily. So the business lobby, the industrial lobby says this is futile, it's a futile exercise. On the other hand, you have criticism saying that this can easily take away land from people. And a lot of suggestions which I had made to my colleague, my esteemed colleague, the Minister for Rural Development, he has incorporated many of them in the bill before it was brought to Parliament. He has accepted a lot. What worries me, not that. Actually, the problem are those, the fourth schedule, which says that certain acts are exempted from this, but then there also have been assured that those acts will be amended to make them compliant with this amended land acquisition bill. I think most of my suggestions have been incorporated. I would only like, like for example, the Coal Mining Act and the Minerals Act. They should also fall within the. They should be compliant with this Land Acquisition Act, and I think for that the decision that's been taken is that those acts will be amended as soon as possible.
So also the land acquisition bill allows the government to acquire land on behalf of corporations. So do you think that there is a threat of land being snatched due to collusion between the state and corporates?
No, but there are several safeguards which have been built in.
I know, but like we've seen the example of the Andhra Pradesh Development Corporation, the way it happened.
Yeah, but the Andhra Pradesh Development Corporation actually, these are blatant constitutional violations, as I mentioned earlier. So that's got nothing to do with this act or that act. There the Constitution is above any other legislation.
Right, but that has never stopped somebody from violating the Constitution.
No, so constitutional violence, you have any act and you can still violate the Constitution. For which you'll have to go to court, you'll have to take it up in the manner that I took up this particular issue. So if you all these things are based on the fact that you play by the rule of the game. Now, if you say that constitutional articles or provisions will not also be adhered to, so then we have no hope. Because our republic is itself based on the Constitution. That's our main foundation.
In the year 2012-2013, 21,000 crores were allotted to various departments under various tribal subplan schemes. How has this money been spent so far?
There is this funds which you refer to. This is from central funds which are supposed to go from these line ministries to the tribal subplan areas. The fund which my ministry gets is nothing, it's peanuts compared to this. My budget allocation for the whole year is 4,100 crores. And in fact, last year, 24% of this was cut off because of the fiscal prudence that was. Now, when I started going through the funds that these other ministries were supposed to spend on tribal subplan area, I found that only the HRD ministries were supposed to allocate more than 5,000 crores, which is actually more than my entire budget allocation. Likewise, the Health Ministry, the Environment and Forest Ministry, and several other ministries were supposed to spend a certain percentage for this particular purpose. My ministry had no idea of where this money was going and how it was being spent. So when we inquired from state governments, many state governments did not have any information. So when I asked the HRD, for example, I'll give you one instance, I was told that this is being spent for midday meal scheme. So I said midday meal scheme is a universal program which is meant for all. It doesn't exclude the tribals or the tribal subplan areas, and this fund was meant to be spent for other critical gaps to be filled. Midday meal schemes are basically given in day schools. Now in tribal areas, most of the schools are boarding schools. They're residential schools, they're ashram schools. So I really don't know what has been happening, but they've been shown in different accounts and heads. But unfortunately, I had no further answer from them, and they said no, 80% has gone on this, so that's it. Then when the Ministry of Environment and Forest, they gave some information which said that this 1,000 crores is supposed to be what MOF was supposed to spend, and they spent it on elephant project. Now when you say elephant project, I mean what connection does it have? I mean, this is the mindset. It's unfortunate. You're going to treat tribals like as another part of the animal world. In my view, the ideal thing would be for the money to be transferred on these different heads from the respective ministry in a separate account. I don't know how it's to be done this for.
So do you think that dismantling archaic laws, that undermine the ability of tribals to make decisions for themselves? Like there's been the Protection of Scheduled Tribes Act in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh that prevents tribals from cutting their own trees and selling them to the government. I mean, you've seen devastating effects of that in these two states. So do you think that we need to dismantle these archaic laws first before we put on, layers and layers of bureaucratic setup?
You see, this is a simultaneous process. Like, for example, I don't know whether you're aware, about a month ago, last month or very recently, the Supreme Court has, in one of its judgments, said that all minerals which are under a piece of land which belongs to you also belong to you. Earlier on, you see, the general impression was that anything under the soil belongs to the government beyond a certain depth. But the Supreme Court has clearly stated that that's not the case. Court has even said that nothing in the constitution or any other law says that anything under the soil belongs to the government. See, the government can be a custodian of these resources where somebody doesn't have ownership of the land. But if you have ownership over a piece of land, except with the exception of the Treasure Trove Act, which already exists, raw mineral resources which are there under the earth, the court very rightly said belongs to the owner of the land. You see, we have different processes which are going on. Courts are interpreting them, and in many, I think in many cases they've had to do so under pressing circumstances. I mean, these are all a part of our constitutional evolution which is taking place. So I don't think one law can wait for any other law. They'll go on simultaneously, and you see, they'll have to, be compliant with each other as we go forward.
So, and do you think that the food security ordinance is enough to tackle the problem of malnutrition among tribals?
You see, it's not the food security alone may not be enough, but certainly it will complement or supplement the other efforts that we are making.
So what do you think needs to be done, and where do you think the food security ordinance will fall short when it comes to tribals?
You see, when it comes to tribal, the food security will certainly today provide something when the tribals don't have anything. Like one good thing is that the food security bill also takes care of, it also has a reference to millets. And millets is something which are consumed by tribals, forest dwellers in large number. It's a good source of protein, it's healthy food. And I think you may have noticed that millets are much cheaper than rice or wheat. So it will help the tribal communities. But while giving them this assurance via the food security bill, it doesn't mean that you should deprive them or strip them of all their traditional sources of livelihood of food grains which they've been enjoying for over these years. Yes. So it's more, this should actually complement or supplement that rather than, strip them of their existing rights and they, with the plea that something has been given now from this new act.
So also last week, the Cabinet Committee on Investment has cleared infrastructure projects worth 1.83 lakh crores.
Yes.
So how is the implementation of the Forest Rights Act faring in these areas?
You see, in fact, we have not been monitoring it directly from here. It's a state subject, so whenever anyone wants any data on this, we ask the state governments to do so. And we've been actually holding conferences, regional conferences, where my officers from my ministry, senior officers, go and they sensitize. They have discussions with the local bureaucrats of the state, with forest officials, revenue officials. I've been in communication with my colleagues, the ministers for tribal affairs, forest department, also the chief ministers in some cases. So as far as we are concerned, you see, my effort is actually to bring about an awareness among the people. People should first know their rights.
So what do you think are the dangers of the government acquiring land on behalf of private players in the new land bill?
You see, I think, as I told you, there are several safeguards which are already being brought in. In fact, earlier on, these safeguards also were not there. So this post 2013 bill definitely the farmers will be in a better position than they were earlier on. Because earlier on even this bill was not there. And in many cases, a lot of this land which was acquired for a particular purpose was not used for that purpose.
But then again, you know, industrial agents and those lobbies are stronger than farmers' lobbies.
Yeah, they are. But despite that, this bill has come. You see, now they'll have to pay 4 times the circle rate for acquisition. They'll have to pay solatium of 100%. If they don't use it for the purpose for which it's being acquired, then within a period of time, then this land will revert back to the owners. And you'll have to get the consent of people. So you see, there have been a lot of, as far as consent is concerned, there have been a lot of complaints that there have been contrived resolutions. By force they've given consent, they made people to give the consent. But one standing example is of Niyamgiri, where in a scheduled area, you know, they thought that tribals could easily be manipulated and managed, but you saw what happened in those 12 Gram Sabhas. So that is actually a result of the awakening of the people, where people, once they know their rights, they are prepared to come out and
But still, isn't that a gaping hole in the whole framework of the law, where, you know, there can easily be collusion between the state and industrialists?
You see, that can be there even without this. You can't stop it. So you will have to just, there have to be checks and balances. There can be. But then how do you stop that? Ultimately, in a democracy.
What could have been the checks and balances?
You see, ultimately, you see, the people in a democracy will have to mercilessly throw out those who have misused their power for this purpose while in government.